Brilliant. Okay, we are adding people as we go, but I think as we are about 5 minutes after the starting time, we'll start to begin this morning. So firstly, again, welcome International Women's Day, and welcome Amazin. Thank you so much for joining us. It's just such a pleasure to have you. And for those of us who don't know loads about your background, if you could share a little overview of your personal story and your career, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's truly a pleasure to speak today, IWD, for University of Birmingham. Thank you everyone who is listening today. So I will kind of start at the beginning because it really makes context sense for all the advocacy work that I do today. I spent my formative years growing up in Australia, in a time where there was a terrible amount of racism in the country towards Asian people. I grew up in an all-white background. I'm a transracial adoptee, so I always physically looked very different, and I encountered a terrible amount of bullying and racism as a child because I was Asian. And I think I've kind of heard every Asian slur, except there actually have been a few new ones since the pandemic, which we'll get to at a later stage. And I entered into sports at a very early age because I think, when you feel different inside and you're bullied, you always wanted to find a sense of community. I knew very young that I was part of the LGBTQ community, but I wasn't able to verbalize it at all. I never met an LGBTQ person until my late teens. I never saw an Asian person on TV, nor did I see an LGBTQ person in the media. So I had this feeling inside that I knew I was different, but I didn't know how to express it, and I didn't know the word for it, which was very confusing for me as well. I entered into sports very early on as a child. I started bodybuilding at 6 at a very young age. And it was really because in team sports, I felt it was a very hostile environment for Asian kids. And I know a lot of Asian people, when we go into sports, we're one of one in sports. So we encounter a terrible amount of bullying and racism. And I did from my teammates, from other teams, and from my coaches. And I really fell into bodybuilding with some dumbbells that were lying around in my home. And I just found that it was something that I chose. It was something that I could do myself. And it gave me the confidence to be myself. It gave me the self-worth that I needed. And it allowed me to stand in my truth, to be unapologetic about being Asian, about being part of the LGBTQ community, and being the advocate that I am today. Though I never had, people look at my life and think you must have had so many people that believed in you for all the body of work that you've done. And I never had anyone that believed in me at all. So it was really just this belief within myself. I've had some quite horrible moments throughout my journey. I had a moment when I was a kid and the teacher made me stand up in front of all the other kids in the class. I must have been about 7 or 8. And they said, the teacher said to me, this is what failure looked like. And all the kids laughed at me. And I just thought at that moment, I'll never feel humiliated like this again. And, so many kids of color go through this experience. So many Asian kids, so many Black kids, so many LGBTQ kids have experienced bullying within the school system and not feeling like they've had a support network or anyone that they could turn to that fully understands where they're coming from. And we experience this throughout our entire life. And, you know, as a young adult, as a young teenager, I went into competing competitively as a bodybuilder. The racism and bullying followed me. I encountered also a terrible amount of homophobia, particularly the use of the word gay as a slur. You know, as a young adult, if I kind of can fast track into my young adulthood, you know, because I never had a sense of self or a sense of community, I always kind of say, you know, you're one person away from falling into the bad crowd. You can be at least at times a paycheck away from falling into poverty. And, you know, and that's what happened to me. You know, when I ended up traveling the world and coming to Europe and spending a lot of time in Europe, you know, I ended up in the bad crowd, drugs, alcohol, partying 24/7. And I ended up homeless for a number of years, and, you know, very suicidal, very depressed, suffering from severe mental health, living in poverty. And I could see very clearly then as to how society treated you when you're living on the margins of society, and a lack of support network, and how difficult it is to pull yourself out when you have no one to support you, and how people look at you as if you have no dreams, no hopes. But just because you're experiencing something very terrible in your life doesn't mean that you don't have a hope for a better tomorrow and have all these amazing dreams for yourself. It was very difficult to pull myself out of the situation, and it was probably the hardest thing that I ever did. And for me, it's a lifetime of sports that helped me, going back to that mindset of an athlete where you have to push past very difficult situations. And I put myself into that mindset again, though it was still very difficult. I had a nervous breakdown doing it. It took me many years, but, you know, it led to this advocacy work that I do today. It wouldn't have been for my personal journey of going through these, you know, difficult times in my life and pulling on that strength to triumph, that I am here today sharing my story.
Honestly, thank you so much. I know, because we've got such a strong international community, it means a lot to share everything that you've shared. I'm sure there's so much that resonates with all our students, and elements of bullying, I'm sure, affect all of us at some parts of our lives as well. Particularly, you know, is there anything further that non-Asian students and staff might not be aware of in terms of cultural experience, maybe particularly in reference to LGBTQ experience, and also sport, things that you can sort of pass on to help us be better allies as well?
You know, I think when we think of allyship, and I'm asked this all the time, and I have multiple, you know, I think of intersectionality, and I have multiple identities that make me a whole person. You know, one, I'm an Asian woman. I'm a woman. I'm from the LGBTQ community, and, you know, how, you know, racism, you know, surfaces could be through different ways, you know, through structural racism, through white privilege. You know, we have to check in on our own privilege. I can encounter racism because, you know, for various different reasons, or discrimination because I'm a woman, maybe not necessarily because I'm Asian, or sometimes because I'm Asian, not necessarily because I'm a woman, or sometimes because I'm LGBTQ, not necessarily because I'm Asian or a woman. And we have to understand these differences, particularly if we're going to change hearts and minds, particularly if we're going to look at policy change, particularly when we're looking at sports equality, of how do we create safe and nurturing environments for athletes who are Black, who are Asian, who look different from us, who, you know, maybe from the LGBTQ community. When we're looking at trans inclusion in sports, we also have to understand the cultural differences and sensitivities, because for the most part, when you know, and obviously I particularly speak from the Asian community because I'm Asian, is that, you know, we're immigrants. You know, we may live in two different worlds, the world that is the world from being Asian in our community and the Western world that we live in. You know, we may be in the UK or another Western country, and this may be the first time that we've experienced liberation of being LGBTQ and being free in a space where we can express ourselves, but we still may be, you know, hidden in our Asian community. And so when we think of how do we be allies for people that are different from us, it's not just being an ally, it's being an advocate, it's being my champion when I'm not in the room. It's not just a rainbow pin or a trans pin that you wear or saying I support the BLM movement, or I support, you know, anti-racism, you know, all those things. It's, you know, when I'm, for a lot of times, you know, anti-LGBTQ rhetoric or things that are racist or sexist or xenophobic happen when I'm not in the room. And it's, do you raise your voice at that point? Do you challenge that person? Do you educate that person? Because I'm Asian all the time. I can't switch it off. I'm LGBTQ all the time. It's not just during Pride Month. And I think, you know, the pandemic has given us a time to check in on ourselves, check in on our own behavior and our unconscious bias. We need to think before we speak around the language that we use as well. Is that lifting someone up, or is that hurtful towards someone? Because a joke that we may use, and if we start becoming very current when we're looking at the pandemic, when we attach an ethnicity to a pandemic and start using things like, well, it's the China virus, it's the Kung flu virus, you're then targeting a whole community. And we've seen this, the global spreads of violence and discrimination towards Asian people. And this was happening long before the pandemic. It's just risen now. And it's, you know, how that makes me feel as an Asian person, where you hold me responsible for the worst health crisis in the world. And it's like, you know, I'm not a virus, I'm a human being.
Yeah, I think what you're, you know, what you say around this is so powerful. And it's that the standard by which you should judge yourself is always the whole, you know, don't go by, well, was I silent at that time because I was like, I'm unsure. But as you're right, as a true advocate, it's about speaking out all the time if something you see isn't right, or if you think prejudices are being perpetuated. So thanks. I think that's a really helpful reminder as well for all of us that, you know, if we're working with students or colleagues that we are just undergoing prejudice that we just don't see as well. So, you know, being a very, I always think of being a proactive or being a very active ally as opposed to just a passive ally or a passive advocate, is, it makes a really big difference. So no, it's so helpful. Thank you. Kind of speaking of being an ambassador as well, could you tell us a bit more about some of your ambassador roles? And I know you've got a really exciting new Pride House role for the Commonwealth Games next year as well. So if you could tell us a bit about that, that would be really exciting.
Sure. You know, when I was a child, I always want to make this impact through sports because of the way sports made me feel. You know, I wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't a lifetime full of sports and the life skills that it gave me. But when I first stepped onto the field as a child, I saw instantly how the sports community treated people that were different, and particularly the Asian community, because you just don't see us in numbers. I mean, when you look at Team GB, you don't see someone that looks like me. When you look at professional sports across the Western world, you see very few Asian athletes at the top because our journey is very difficult. And I saw very instantly that this stereotype of what it is to be Asian in sports. And, you know, I never set out to be this advocate that I am today and the ambassador to so many organizations. What I did set out was to share my story and the story and challenges of Asian people, particularly in sports, and being Asian and LGBTQ as well, and those challenges. And barriers and how we can change hearts and minds, which kind of led me to this long journey of being an ambassador, because I feel that, you know, if you're really going to create change, you have to constantly sit in the room with decision makers at all different levels. You know, if that's, you know, those that run the university, those that run your sports team, businesses, governments. So, you know, if I look at this kind of journey, you know, in 2014, I became the first Asian ambassador for Athlete Ally. 2019, I became the first Asian athlete ambassador for Stonewall UK. And then just recently, I became the ambassador for Copenhagen, only one of two Asians for Copenhagen 2021. That happens in Denmark in August. And it'll be the first time that a country has won World Pride and Euro Games at the same time. And, you know, and this conversation that I will have in August with Copenhagen 2021 is pinnacle, because they've never had an ambassador track that includes Asian advocates, athletes. And we've never been able to speak at that level about, you know, athlete activism within the Asian community, and what does that look like, particularly for allies and advocates. And now my recent ambassador role, which is my fifth, for Pride House 2021, the Commonwealth Games, you know, and we have, you know, Asian countries as part of the Commonwealth Games. Majority of the Commonwealth countries that are part of the Games have anti-LGBTQ laws. I'll be one of only two Asian ambassadors, but we can have these, you know, courageous conversations, difficult conversations, but also conversations that are long lasting towards, you know, diversity and inclusion in sports, because sports should be welcoming for everyone at all different levels. And as an entree, on March the 15th, I'll be named a Federation Gay Games ambassador as well, my sixth ambassador role.
Well done. That's very exciting.
But these ambassador roles are important, obviously, not just for me, but also for amplifying social causes within the community, because so rarely Asian people hear themselves or hear their stories. And so rarely do we hear from Asian LGBTQ athletes. And it's a revolutionary act when you see yourself for the first time. And I know how much it would have meant to me years ago if I saw someone like myself sharing my story today, and what that would mean for me.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you're now being that for others, that's so much part of the battle, because it's just so hard to visualize yourself sometimes if there is no mirror, like you say. There's no visual to aspire to in that sense, you know. So by creating it, you know, it hopefully, yeah, paves the way for so many other people. This doesn't have to necessarily be a big question, but I know you just touched on the gay games, and before we sort of previously spoke anyway, I was only vaguely aware of it myself. I'd only recently heard of it, and this is probably really a question I could have saved to the end, but I'm cheating and doing it now. Just in terms of sort of the continuing importance of the gay games, it doesn't have to be much, but just maybe just a little bit about it, when it's taking place and things like that, just for our listeners who might not be aware of it.
Sure. I mean, for me, the importance of the gay games is for, you know, I mean, people ask this question a lot. Why do we need the gay games? Why should gay people be competing in their silo? Shouldn't they be able to compete in any sport, everywhere they want? Absolutely. But the gay games provides a vehicle for advocacy for LGBTQ athletes, but it also provides a safe and nurturing space that general sports doesn't necessarily have. We still have so much work to do there. And it's a stepping stone for LGBTQ people who are athletes, just, you know, to feel comfortable before they go to that next stage. So the next Gay Games is in Hong Kong in 2022. This is groundbreaking, because for the first time there'll be gay games in Asia, and the amount of conversations and advocacy work we can do around, lifting up Asian LGBTQ voices, encouraging Asian athletes, not just in the continent, but all over the world, to participate in the gay games, because visibility is so important, and to activate allyship around the gay games in Hong Kong and around the continent, around LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think putting it in that context just makes it even more significant. And absolutely, sometimes when I'm talking to people, I'm trying to explain, still the continuing importance of things like, for example, Pride or sort of LGBTQ specific events. And it is that people might be very on board with inclusivity, but there's that whole, but it would just be great if everything was for everybody. Yeah, that would be fantastic, wouldn't it? But there's still some aspects, like you said.
People always ask, well, why do we need a pride when you seem to have equality in your country?
Yeah,
because the fight still continues. Like if you look at the UK, even though there's equality, hate crime has increased, and you need to understand that for that one moment, this could be the first time an LGBTQ person has experienced a celebration with other LGBTQ people, and what this feels like to be in a space where you're celebrated and loved. And you also need to think of, I think now on this conversation, there are international students on this conversation who, for the first time, they may have been to a London Pride. This is the first time they may have experienced of being openly out and what that feels like. So we continually need to have this space, and having LGBTQ movements and prides in other countries where there's hostility means so much as well. So it's a movement that we continually need to have, because regardless of how much equality that we have, there's always a pushback, and we can see it in terms of what's happening in the US around trans rights.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think that being that continuing push to be visible and be included, that's it. It's being included and being okay to be yourself. That's the drive. And yeah. And then speaking of which as well, I always really appreciate, in all your interviews, you always, you explain your own pronouns, and the whole pronoun discussion is something that the university and our guild as well have really been taking very seriously. And as in, including our pronouns in all staff signatures, so that it's just opening that conversation. So not to almost answer my own question effectively, which I realize, but just talking me through like how you've found being able to talk about your own pronouns, how that's helped to free others to know that they're in a safe space and things like that. Tell me a little bit more about how you found that for yourself.
I mean, for me, pronouns are part of my identity, and I think particularly if you're trans or non-binary, it's so much a part of one's identity. And this is who I am, this is how I show up. I personally identify as a woman, and I have from birth, and and I say, my pronouns are she and her. Some people feel very uncomfortable around this question, so I always introduce myself as she and her. And you see it if you go across all my social media where I put she and her, which then opens up the dialogue for other people to be able to say, then my pronouns are whatever they are. And I always say that, particularly when allies ask, what happens if I make a mistake, or should I say, what happens if I say the wrong thing? I always say, ask the question. I don't mind if people ask me questions. I would rather you ask the questions than guess and then maybe get it wrong, and then then that could lead into something else. But that shows that you're willing to learn if you're willing to ask the question. And I always think there's just such little things that you can do by when you introduce yourself. My name is such and such, my pronouns are such and such, on your email signature, on your social media as well. And you could always ask that person as well. You know, how would you like to be introduced, or how, you know, what are your pronouns? Because that shows that you take an invested interest in the other person as well, and you're willing to learn.
Yeah, I think, yeah, and having it, hopefully for all of those listening, having that message, again, it's for so much of people with if LGBTQ experiences are outside of their own personal experience, it might feel like, oh, but I'm okay. That again, we come back to, but I'm okay and I'm accepting of everybody, which is definitely how I previously felt. Like I hadn't included my pronouns in my signature because I'm sort of going, but I'll be accepting of everybody. But then it's like, it's that proactive advocacy rather than just, oh, if someone wants to volunteer their pronouns, I'll use whatever they like, but you're creating a space where someone feels comfortable to do so. And I think, you know, engaging with that is amazing. So thank you so much for sharing about that. And you know, we've just discussed quite a bit about how we can be good advocates, and I wanted to know, you know, especially in light of International Women's Day, just tell us a little bit about what choose to challenge means to you. I mean, we've already covered quite a lot of bits and pieces of this, but anything else that you wanted to touch on, particularly with relation to either your own personal experience or going forwards, what the world might look like, yeah, after lockdown starts to change, or
when I think of choose to challenge, I think of my hashtag that I came up with, you know, being a voice with action. You know, and I go back to this because the pandemic has given us a time to reset and stop, and we need to start thinking, as the world opens up, what kind of world do we want? It has to be a different world from what we've had in the past. You know, for me as an athlete, you know, sport is a language that everyone understands. It brings people together. It can create social change, and we need to use these major platforms that are around the world to have these courageous and at times very difficult conversations. And I think, you know, every day we can choose to challenge, to raise our voice against racism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia. You know, we need to be part of the solution, because, you know, silence is violence. You know, we need to choose to challenge ourselves to be better people, to be not just allies, but advocates, because I think LGBTQ people are your friends, your loved ones, your colleagues, the people that cut your hair, serve you. We pass you in the street. It's the same for me being Asian. You know, I'm your friend, I'm your colleague, you know, your loved ones. You know, think about how it would make someone dear to you feel if you remain silent and you didn't choose to challenge in a moment where you could have made a difference.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, the powerful message that kind of runs through all the things that we've talked about, which is absolutely lovely. I want we do have, sorry, my dog's very excited in the background, so apologies for the slight little noises you can hear. That's just George. I wanted to, before we move to the questions and answers, I did just want to ask whether there was anything else that you normally love to share when you give one of these interviews, any other powerful message, but we do have some lovely questions and answers, so we can go to questions. But I know, you know, you shared like sort of your bullying story in the past as well, and you mentioned as well about, you know, we've already sort of covered, you know, sort of some slurs and stuff you've had to face, but in terms of like, yeah, messaging for international community going forwards, whether there was anything else that you wanted to share or anything else that's helped you.
I think so. I think, you know, being a possibility model and sharing your story is so important, because, you know, when we look at the LGBTQ community, you know, we don't have enough stories shared. And then if we break it down even more, if you're Asian and LGBTQ, you know, we don't have the stories to share. I mean, on UK television, you never see a person that looks like me, and you very rarely see LGBTQ people. You know, in TV and film per se, you know, Asian people only make up 1%. So it's like, you know, think about how you can share your story with the world. Think about how you can invite people into your story and the difference that will make to the lives of others. Because I never had any role models. And when I grew up, I had to create a possibility in my mind of the world that I wanted to see and the dreams that I wanted to have, which was very difficult, growing up like that. And I think what I wanted to touch on as well is, the difficult time through the pandemic. It's been a difficult time for all of us. Many of us have felt isolated. I know, you have many international students who haven't been able to go home, and even local students who may not have been able to go home, and that kind of isolation and, the weighing of our mental health, being LGBTQ, and maybe being stuck in situations where, an environment where people aren't nurturing and celebrating who you are. And I think never be afraid to speak up, never be afraid to ask for help of, those at the university. Make sure you check in with your friends as well. Just, I found just even sending someone a text of how are you doing, calling someone. I know it's been a very difficult time for the Asian community around the terrible COVID racism that we've seen, not just in the UK, but around the world. And it's become obviously particularly bad at the moment in the US. And, thing is, how can you be right now a really good ally and advocate to the Asian community? Your discussions around anti-racism have to include the Asian community. Check in with your Asian friends to see how they are. Be interested in our identity and our culture. Be sensitive of, our difference in terms of, where we've come from. Stop before you speak and check in with your own language, because you may find it funny to talk about the Kung flu virus or the China virus, but Asian people find it offensive, and this kind of rhetoric leads to violence and further discrimination and isolation of Asian people. And I have suffered, racism during the pandemic because I'm Asian as well, and what that feels like to be blamed for the world's worst health crisis. So we need to check in with ourselves and our behavior and our unconscious bias in this time. It's so important as we go through, the pandemic is still going to continue, but as also we come out of the pandemic, of what kind of world that we want to see. And I think, it all comes down to choosing to challenge, hate rhetoric in society.
Yeah, I think raising that awareness as well for those of us that, like, I wasn't even aware of those terms. Maybe I'm just living in my little hiding in my flat with George. So I'm lucky in the sense that the people I must speak to, I'm hoping don't perpetuate these things, so I'm not aware of them. But it's like exactly what you say, checking in with friends and being aware of the fact that their experience of the last few months, we all know it's been different for all of us, but adding that extra racial element to it is just something that I'm so glad that you brought to my attention, especially over the next, few weeks, months, as the university starts to open up again, checking in on, we've got such a strong international group. So I work at Sport and Fitness, and, aware that it's not just how have you been? Yeah, it's been really difficult, very difficult in a very different way for a whole group of people. And I think, and sharing that personal story with us makes, again, us better advocates, and I really appreciate it. So I'm gonna move some of the questions from the Q&A box, because we've had some fantastic ones and just some fantastic feedback as well. So Luke asks and says, thanks so much for your time today. As a sports fan, I'm dismayed when I hear stories about LGBTQ plus sports people feeling they have to hide their sexuality. And what are your thoughts, Amazin? on how to encourage these sports people to feel comfortable to express, or not, depending on what's right for them, their sexuality.
Sure. You know, we do have challenges in sports because we just don't see the out LGBTQ athletes in numbers that we should. I mean, if I quickly go back to the last Olympics where they said, oh, you know, we've never seen so many out LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics, we had to be very specific and say, we've never seen so many white LGBTQ athletes at the Olympics. It's so hard when you're, you know, an Asian person or a Black person or someone that's not white to come out because of the struggles of the multiple layers of discrimination. And I think, you know, how do we create safe and nurturing environments so people can bring them whole selves to work? You know, you need to, one, make sure that you have policies in place that are, you know, that support, you know, what needs to take place when there's some form of discrimination, policies in place to support LGBTQ people, particularly trans inclusion in sports. You know, you can show allyship without saying anything by wearing, you know, rainbow laces, a rainbow pin, a trans pin. You know, you can have a pride day in your sports club or your sports department to showcase allyship. And you can do storytelling as well. Like, you know, what the University of Birmingham is doing right now is fantastic, bringing someone from the LGBTQ community in to share their story and to share their experience as well, because storytelling is so much about educating ourselves around the lives of people that are different from us.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything you've shared, you know, reinforces this. We've had a question which is interesting because me and you touched on this before when we were looking at the structure of how today was going to be. It's regarding how we can increase trans inclusion in sports. And I mean, me and Amazin discussed briefly at the time, both of us are cisgender women. We are very aware that this is not part of our personal experience. Amazin's just touched on sort of advocacy, and there are some, I'm just going to say very quickly, there are some really helpful articles, and also just in terms of how certain sports have moved forward with this. In terms of increasing trans inclusion in sport, it all depends on, there's different ways we can address this, whether from a grassroots level, whether from an elite level, and whether you're looking at individual sports, whether you're looking sort of across the board. And there's a lot of work being done recently and a lot of articles, and even just a really short, I can put some in the question and answer box for people if you want to have a little look at it. Amazin, if you want to add in anything else that you found that's been helpful to look at this time, or anything else that Gay Games are potentially looking at that you're aware of, or whether it's still.
When I think about how to increase trans inclusion in sport, it starts with me being an ally and an advocate to the trans community. And again, it's speaking up when a trans person isn't in the room, and, you know, challenging transphobia and educating that person as to the reasons why we can't be transphobic in society. So you need to ask yourself, well, what am I doing to increase? What am I doing as a trans ally? Am I being an advocate? Do we have policies in place around trans inclusion in sports? Are we creating safe and nurturing environments to encourage, you know, not just trans people, but all LGBTQ people in sports? And, you know, we need to look to what's happening in the US at the moment with 29 anti-trans bills that are happening across the US. And some of those bills are looking at passing this week, particularly in South Dakota, Alabama, Mississippi has already passed through the Senate, and they're attacking trans girls in sports and banning them from trans girls playing sports, and also healthcare as well. And it's also educating ourselves, because a lot of the transphobia is baseless, and they're trying to create a solution to a problem that doesn't exist either. So it's important to educate yourself around trans inclusion in sports as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, off the back of that, I'll definitely post some articles that I found interesting, because exactly what Amazon said, I realized it was a gap in my knowledge, and I've attempted as much as possible to educate myself so I can be a better ally, like you say, you know, and it's looking at all levels where we can be more supportive. So no, great question. Thank you. Happy International Women's Day is being wished. Thank you very much. They're loving this webinar so far, and they say you're amazing. I do enjoy that. Amazin is amazing. It's lovely. My question is, for those who wish to educate themselves more and gain a better insight, and this isn't, I know I just touched on trans, but I'm going to ask Amazin the question from a wider perspective. Are there any resources, maybe books or podcasts, that can give a better sort of broad insight of the themes you've talked about today?
Sure. So if you go to my website that I've just posted in the chat box, AmazonLêThi.com, I talk a lot about this all the time. So you can go through all my press. I've got a lot of podcasts that I've done with different entities, and obviously, you know, you can go through those podcasts as well. And then the organizations that I'm a part of, like Stonewall UK, Athlete Ally, Copenhagen 2021, Pride House, Gay Games, they also have a lot of resources on their websites as well.
That's great, thank you. Fabulous. So all of that's in the chat box. If you just scroll up to the top, Amazon already put all that in for us, and I'll add some more stuff at the bottom at the end. I'll move on to the next question. Lovely to see this level of honesty, which is so needed, 100%. And your next question, being one of the only Asians in your field of work, do you feel pressure in having to speak on behalf of a whole community or several communities, which kind of touches on someone else's question as well? And how does this feel, and what sort of impact does this have on you, which is very sensitive, very kind.
Well, thank you. For everyone has such lovely questions. Thank you. You know, I don't feel I can speak for the entire Asian community. I mean, we're looking at like 1.4 billion. Oh, sorry. But I can speak about my own personal experience, and that, you know, for many Asian people, you know, that is a universal experience in terms of, you know, the levels of racism that we receive, you know, how we're othered in the community, how people see us as a community in terms of being Asian, and the stereotypes that are attached to that. You know, I feel with the platforms that I absolutely have a responsibility to speak up. I absolutely have a responsibility to have these, and it's just in my nature as a person to be very raw and honest and open and have courageous conversations, because if you're going to shift the needle to bend towards equality, you have to have uncomfortable conversations. You have to get uncomfortable to get comfortable, and you have to be courageous. And I have to share my story because so many people don't hear this kind of story to fully understand how you change hearts and minds, and how you create change within your country, and the change of policy as well that will lead to equality.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Olwyn's given us some lovely feedback, which I'm just going to save for in a second, and I'm just going to ask one of Ali's questions. That's George yawning in the background because he wants to walk, bless him. So apologies for his background noise. Ali wants to know what you've been doing during the lockdown to look after your own mental health, and if you've discovered anything new about yourself or your identity as a result of the pandemic.
I do a lot of self-care to keep my own mental health on track. I mean, you know, it's been a very difficult time for everyone, you know, that the feeling of touch starvation, spending hours on, you know, Zoom calls when you're just kind of looking into a screen. I do a lot of exercise. I walk every day. I have a number of friends who have dogs, so I do animal therapy by walking their dogs. I still keep up my weight training with resistance bands and dumbbells. I do meditation as well. I think, we need to calm our mind in this time, and I do a lot of gratitude work as well each day. And I make a point of limiting social media and news, because we have so much garbage coming into a box onto our screens, which also, can increase anxiety as well and spike our mental health. And I kind of say to everyone, you should 1 to 2 hours before you go to bed not look at any form of technology, not look at any screen. I actually put on classical music because it's very calming. So I do things like that. And I also, obviously, my friends in my bubble, I see, and I connect with people as well online. I think you should still try and find different ways to remain connected.
I think that's really helpful, and all the different ways as well you look after yourself. And I find, so I in real life, as well as my lovely job at UB Sport, I'm also a class instructor as well, and by doing some classes virtually, and that's a mix, but again, it's that lovely human interaction. I think I enjoy that just as much, if not more, than the actual exercise.
Yes, we all miss it. And I think what's really important during this time is to have a routine, because it's very easy for days just to kind of merge into each other and wake up and go, what day is it? And I think as well, it's okay if you have a day where you can't get up and you just want a day of nothing. And we've all had those days. I've had those days. Be kind. It's so important just to be kind to yourself, because the world has slowed down just as much as you've slowed down. And if one day you just can't respond to one email and all you need to do is just lie in bed and have hot chocolate and watch Netflix, that's okay.
I think that's the best. I mean, I love all of your advice, but I think that advice probably speaks to us all. I love it. And Ali, who I work with as well, actually, so thank you for joining in, Ali. Are there any sports that you feel are paving the way for LGBTQ athletes in terms of their approach or inclusivity? That's a great question, and definitely something.
Wow,
I know.
That's a great question. In terms of their approach and inclusivity, I think I always cite tennis, because I think of Billie Jean King as such an icon when it came to gender equality and LGBTQ equality, and tennis has done well in terms of equality. Obviously, it has still so much work to do. Then I think of women's soccer, and I think of Megan Rapinoe. There are many LGBTQ women in soccer, but we still have so much to do when it comes to men's soccer. I can't, there's not one sport where you just think, oh, they've just done it so right. Everything they do, tick, 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 tick. We still have so much to do across all sports when it comes to LGBTQ equality and diversity in inclusion. But I always say, it starts with me. It starts with you. Think about the sport that you're playing right now. Take a step back and think, are there any LGBTQ people who are openly out? If not, what do we need to do to create a safe and nurturing environment? Or look at the sport. I think take a snapshot of your team and look at it. They were showing some time ago the British hockey team and how great it was. And I thought, no, there's an issue with it because everyone is white. You need to look at your sport and think, is it diverse? Is it inclusive? Is everyone at the table? If not, how do we make it so everyone can feel like they can be part of this team?
Yeah, I think looking at things with fresh eyes has just been one of another great takeaway. Like, we so often look at things through our own lens, and it's harder to challenge ourselves all the time to see things from other people's perspective. But just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it and shouldn't be actively, again, being inclusive. So thank you. I'll read Olwyn's lovely comment. So Olwyn's one of our Sport Fitness members, so hope you're keeping well, lovely. Not a question, but a positive comment, feedback. And this is our last question as well, unless anyone wants to add in anything. So Amazin, anything you want to add after this is lovely. Thank you so much for mentioning the gay games. I see myself as an LGBTQ plus ally and try to learn about as many LGBTQ plus related issues as I can. But up to now, I'd never heard of the gay games mentioned anywhere else, not even when I was consciously searching online for info about racism, discrimination and inclusivity in sports. And this goes back to autumn 2019. Then she's like, how come it wasn't mentioned? Possibly because of low visibility. And just mentions again, visibility is really important. Thank you ever so much for all you've been doing to raise your voice and empower people.
Thank you. That was a very nice comment. I think what I want people to kind of leave from today is really going back to the comment of choose to challenge, of making sure that you're not just an ally, you're an advocate. When you go back to wherever you're, if that's where you're living or your class or whatever you're doing today, think about your Asian friends in this time of what we've been going through in the pandemic, and check in on us. Maybe this is a time now to send a message, send a phone call, ask how people are. And then if you're struggling, reach out. Never be afraid to reach out. Don't think that you have to suffer in silence. And yes, visibility is so important, of not just being an ally, being an advocate, sharing your story, thinking about your life and the hobbies that you have, and think, how can I make sport more inclusive for everyone? Or if you're part of another social group at the university, how do I make that more inclusive of everyone? What kind of other conversations can I have to bring everyone to the table on?
Thank you. That's incredible. I've just quickly popped in the sidebar as well. Well, Pete has, thank you very much. So just for those of you that were asking just around the questions of trans inclusion, that podcast link, please just let me know if that doesn't work for anyone that's interested, just while I'm still on the call, will be for the next couple of minutes. And that has lots of articles where you can do further reading. So hopefully that will help. Amazin, I literally cannot thank you enough for just making our International Women's Day magical, so inspiring, sharing and making us feel safe, I think, to acknowledge maybe the things that we don't do great, but being comfortable with that, and giving us being kind and giving us the confidence to know that we can look at the new world and take things forward in a more positive way. It means a lot, and it really does embody what we're trying to do at University of Birmingham as well, in terms of inclusion, in terms of well-being, in terms of caring for others and for ourselves. And I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it's been to speak to you.
I want to thank the University of Birmingham for having me, Helen, for the conversation today, and everyone on board. And just what I lastly want to say is, just be kind to yourself. It's been a difficult time for everyone. It's important, to be kind to yourself.
Thank you. This is honestly, thank you so much. So we will draw our lovely panel to a close at this point, but you've got all of Amazin's details. You can follow her on social media. She's doing an amazing chat at midnight tonight, aren't you, Amazin, as well? So
yes, I am. I'm doing another IWD event with the the Irish and Australian consulates in Chicago, and if anyone would like to join that, the sign up is just here. I've just put it in the box.
that's incredible. Thank you.
People can sign up here.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I'm just going to put my email address in again, just for any further questions around University of Birmingham, and I can reroute things to student services, or if there's any questions about UOB in relation to sport inclusion as well, please do just let me know. Honestly, thank you so much. We wish everybody a fantastic rest of International Women's Day. There's some other great events going on. Obviously won't be as great as this, because how could it possibly be? So yes, take care everyone. Have a great day, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.